Okay, welcome to Weekly Marx. This is a little experiment. We're going to just try and see if we can do audio of the book itself.
Chapter ONE The commodity. 1. The two factors of the commodity, use value and value substance, magnitude of value. The wealth of societies dominated by the capitalist mode of production appears in the form of an enormous accumulation of commodities. The individual commodity appears as the elementary form of that wealth. Hence our investigation begins by analyzing the commodity. A commodity is, first of all, an external object, a thing whose properties satisfy human wants or needs of whatever kind. The nature of these wants and needs, whether they come from our belly or our imagination, doesn't matter here. It also doesn't matter how. A commodity is, first of all, an external object, a thing whose properties satisfy human wants or needs of whatever kind. The nature of these wants and needs, whether they come from our belly or our imagination.
A commodity is, first of all, an external object, a thing whose properties satisfy human wants or needs of whatever kind. The nature of these wants and needs, whether they come from our belly or our imagination. A commodity is, first of all, an external object, a thing whose properties satisfy human wants or needs of whatever kind. The nature of these wants and needs, whether they come from our belly or our imagination, doesn't matter here. It also doesn't matter how an object satisfies them, whether directly, as a means of subsistence or enjoyment, or indirectly, as the means to produce something else. Every useful thing, iron, paper, etc., can be considered from two perspectives at once, quality and quantity. Since every such thing is a whole that combines many properties, it can be useful in different ways. Discovering these ways and thus the diverse applications of a thing is a historical act. So is the creation of a society's standards for measuring amounts of useful things. The standards of measurement for commodities differ in part because of the natural differences among the objects measured, in part by convention. The usefulness of a thing makes it into a use value. Usefulness, in this sense, doesn't hover above us in the air. Determined by the properties of a commodity's body, it would not exist without them. Thus a commodity's body, as with iron, wheat, diamonds, etc., is itself a use value or good. Whether or not it has this character doesn't depend on how much work, or how little, human beings have to do to appropriate its useful properties. When considering use values, we always suppose that we are dealing with definite amounts, for example, dozens of watches, yards of linen, tons of iron. The use values of commodities supply the material for an independent discipline, commodity studies. Use value is realized only when something is used or consumed. Whatever social form wealth takes, use values make up its material content. Within the form of society that concerns us here, they also function as the material bearers of exchange value. Exchange value first appears as a quantitative relation, the ratio in which one type of use value is exchanged for another. This relation changes constantly, varying with time and place. Exchange value thus seems to be something accidental and purely relative, and the idea of exchange value as something inherent in, valeur intrinsique, or immanent to a commodity seems to be a contradictionary in adjecto. But let's take a closer look. A single commodity, say 8 bushels of wheat, can be traded for other goods in the most diverse ratios of exchange. But the wheat's exchange value remains the same whether it is expressed as this much boot polish, that much silk, this much gold, or something else. Its exchange value, then, must have a pounds of iron. What does this equation say? That the same amount of a common something exists in two different things, 8 bushels of wheat and 100 pounds of iron. Insofar as it is an exchange value, must be reducible to that something. A simple geometrical example will illustrate this point. In order to establish and compare the surface areas of rectilinear figures, we redraw them as triangles, then reduce the triangles to an expression very different from their visible shapes, 1/2 the base times the height. The exchange values of commodities are likewise reduced to a common something, which they represent in greater or smaller amounts. This common something can't be a geometrical, physical, or chemical property, or acting from their use values. Within this relation, one use value counts for exactly as much as any other, given the right proportion. Or as old Barbon says, one sort of wares are as good as another, if the value be equal. There is no difference or distinction in things of equal value. As use values, commodities differ above all with respect to quality; as exchange values, they can differ only with respect to quantity, and they contain not even an atom of use value. If we set aside the use value belonging to the physical bodies of commodities, just one quality remains: they are products of labor. But the product of labor, too, has been transformed in our hands. If we abstract from its use value, we will be abstracting also from the physical components and forms that made it into a use value in the first place. The product of labor is no longer a table, house, spool of yarn, or any other useful thing. All its sensuous components are wiped away. Neither is it any longer the work of carpentry, construction, weaving, or some other particular kind of productive labor. When the useful character of labor products disappears, so, too, does the useful character of the instances of labor represented in them. What happens, in effect, is that the different concrete forms of those instances of labor vanish as well. They can no longer be distinguished from one another and have all been reduced to the same human labor, abstract human labor. Now let's consider what remains of these labor products. Nothing of them is left over except the same ghostly objecthood, a bare gelatinous blob of undifferentiated human labor power expended without regard to the form of its expenditure. All that these things still represent is this: when they were made, human labor power was expended, human labor accumulated. As crystallized pieces of this social substance, which they consist of collectively, they are values. The exchange value of commodities presented itself to us in their exchange relations as something fully independent of commodities' use values. If we now abstract from the use value of labor products, we will arrive at their value as it was defined above. The common something expressed by commodities' exchange relations or exchange value is, in fact, their value. The course of this examination will eventually bring us back to the notion of exchange value as value's necessary mode of expression. A use value or good has value only because abstract human labor is objectified or materialized in it. How should the magnitude of its value be measured? By the amount of value-creating substance it contains, labor. The amount of labor is measured by its duration, and labor time has its own standard of measurement in definite units of time, such as hours, days, and so on. We might be tempted to think that since the amount of labor expended to produce a commodity determines its value, the lazier or more incompetent the person producing it, the more valuable the commodity will be. After all, he will take longer to produce it. But the labor that constitutes the substance of values is equal human labor, the expenditure of the self-same human labor power. All the labor power represented in the values of the commodity world, the sum of a society's labor power represented in them, counts for something here as one and the same human labor power, even though labor power belonging to innumerable individual people goes into it. Each person's labor power is the same human labor power as any other person's, insofar as it has the characteristic of being socially average labor power and functions as such socially average labor power, which means that it requires only the labor time necessary on average, the labor time socially necessary, to produce a given commodity. Socially necessary labor time is the labor time needed to produce a given use value under a society's normal conditions of production, using labor that has an average level of skill and intensity. When the power loom was introduced in England, the labor needed to turn a given quantity of yarn into fabric likely fell to half of what it had been. The English hand weaver had to expend as much labor time as ever to transform the same amount of material, but now the product of his individual labor hour represented only half a social labor hour, and thus its value dropped by half. It is solely the quantity of socially necessary labor or the socially necessary labor time that goes into making a use value that determines its magnitude of value. Here, each individual commodity counts for something only as an average instance of its type. Commodities that contain equal amounts of labor, in other words, commodities that can be produced in the same amount of labor time, will therefore have the same magnitude of value. A commodity's value has the same relation to the value of every other commodity that the labor time required to produce it has to the labor time required to produce every other commodity. As values, all commodities are nothing but discrete masses of coagulated labor time. A commodity's magnitude of value will not vary, then, as long as the amount of labor time needed to make it remains constant. But the labor time it takes to produce a commodity varies whenever labor's productive power does. A number of factors determine labor's productive power, including workers' average skill level, how far scientific knowledge and its technological applications have developed, the social organization of the production process, the scope and efficiency of the means of production, and conditions in nature. The same quantity of labor that is represented in 8 bushels of wheat during a good harvest might, for example, be represented in only 4 bushels during a bad one. The same quantity of labor will extract more metal from rich mines than poor ones, and so on. Diamonds are hard to find in the Earth's crust. Discovering them thus requires, on average, a lot of labor time, and from this it follows that much labor is represented in a small quantity of diamonds. Jacob doubts that the price of gold has ever corresponded to its full value. That is even truer of diamonds. In 1823, according to Esquage, the spoils from Brazilian diamond mines over the previous 80 years didn't equal the total price of 1.5 years of the country's average sugar or coffee production, even though the diamonds represented far more labor, and thus more value. Applied to more bountiful mines, the same quantity of labor would be represented in a larger number of diamonds, and the diamond's value would fall. If we could easily turn coal into diamonds, their value would drop below that of plain bricks. In general, the greater labor's productive power, the smaller the amount of labor time needed to make a good, and the smaller the amount of labor crystallized in a good, the smaller its value. The reverse is also true: the less productive power labor has, the greater the labor time needed to produce a product and, in turn, the greater a product's value. A commodity's magnitude of value varies directly with the amount of labor realized in it, and inversely with that labor's productive power. A thing can be a use value without being a value. This happens when labor doesn't mediate a thing's usefulness for human beings, as with air, virgin soil, naturally occurring meadows and trees, and so on. A thing can also be both useful and a product of human labor without being a commodity. Anyone who satisfies one of his own wants or needs with something he produced has made a use value, not a commodity, because to produce a commodity is to produce not only a use value but also a social use value, a use value for others. Finally, nothing can be a value without being a use value. If a thing is useless, then so is the labor it contains. The labor doesn't count as labor and thus generates no value. 2. The double character of the labor represented in commodities. First, the commodity presented itself to us as a double something, both use value and exchange value. We then saw that labor, too, when it is expressed as value, loses the particular qualities it has as that which produces use values. I was the first to offer a critical account showing that the labor contained in commodities has such a double nature. Since this point has to be the nub of any real attempt to understand political economy, we need to examine it more closely here. Let's say that we have 2 commodities, a coat and 10 yards of linen. The former has twice the value of the latter, so if 10 yards of linen equals V, the coat equals 2V. The coat is a use value that satisfies a specific want or need. To make the coat, a certain kind of productive activity is required. This activity is defined by its goal, method, object, means, and result. As shorthand, we will say that useful labor is the kind whose usefulness is represented in the use value of the product it makes, or in the product itself, in such a way that the product is a use value. When we view labor from this perspective, we always consider it in terms of its useful effects. Just as the use values coat and linen are qualitatively different, so, too, are the forms of labor they owe their existence to, tailoring and weaving. If these things were not qualitatively different use values, and thus the products of qualitatively different forms of useful labor, they couldn't interact as commodities. A coat is not exchanged for an identical coat, a use value is not exchanged for the same use value. Appearing in the diverse totality of use values or the physical bodies of commodities is another totality, just as multifarious, that of the distinct species, varieties, and sub-varieties of useful labor constituting a social division of labor. The social division of labor makes it possible for commodity production to exist. But the reverse isn't true. Commodity production isn't needed in order for the social division of labor to exist. In the ancient communities of India, labor is socially divided, but this doesn't mean that its products become commodities. Or, to take an example closer to home, labor is systematically divided in every factory, yet this division doesn't presuppose that workers exchange their individual products. Only the products of separate instances of private labor, carried out independently of one another, can interact as commodities. So readers have seen that embedded in every commodity's use value is an instance of useful labor, purposeful, productive activity of a particular kind. Use values cannot interact as commodities if qualitatively different instances of useful labor aren't embedded in them. In a society whose products generally take the form of commodities, that is, in a society of commodity producers, where instances of useful labor are performed independently of one another as the private business of independent producers, this qualitative variety develops into a complex system, a social division of labor. It doesn't matter to the coat, in any case, whether the tailor himself wears it or his customer does. The coat functions as a use value in both scenarios. Similarly, it has no effect on the nature of the coat's relation with the labor that produces it whether or not tailoring has become a specialized profession, an independent pursuit within the social division of labor. Driven by their need for clothing, human beings made coats for thousands of years, doing a tailor's work, before a single person became a tailor. Coats, linen, and all other items of material wealth not found in nature have to be brought into being by a particular kind of purposeful, productive activity, one that assimilates specific natural resources to specific human wants or needs. As the creator of use values, as useful labor, labor is a condition of human existence independent of all forms of society. It is an eternal natural necessity, needed to mediate the human metabolizing of nature and, thus, to mediate human life itself. Use values such as coats and linen, in short, the physical bodies of commodities, combine two elements, natural materials and labor. If we could remove all the different instances of useful labor embedded in coats, linen, and so on, what would be left, always, is the material substrate that exists in nature prior to any human activity. As producers, human beings can, in a sense, operate only as nature does, all they can do is change the form of matter. In addition, they draw constantly on natural forces to carry out this labor of reshaping. Labor isn't the lone source responsible for the use values it produces, or for material wealth, it is their father, to speak with William Petty, and the earth is their mother. Moving on from the commodity as a useful object, let us now turn to commodity value. The coat in our example has twice the value of the linen, a purely quantitative difference that doesn't concern us at the moment. Thus it should suffice simply to remind readers that if the value of the coat is twice that of 10 yards of linen, then 20 yards of linen has the same magnitude of value as the coat. As values, the coat and the linen are things made up of the same substance, they are objective expressions of homogeneous labor. But tailoring and weaving are qualitatively different forms of labor. There are of course social conditions in which a single person still alternately tailors and weaves, and these ways of working represent modified versions of a single individual's labor rather than the clearly demarcated functions of different individuals, just as the coat our tailor makes today and the pants he makes tomorrow merely imply variations of the same individual labor. One can see, moreover, that in our capitalist society a given portion of human labor now turns to tailoring, now to weaving, changing what it pursues as the demand for labor varies. This shapeshifting on labor's part doesn't happen without friction, but it has to happen. If we now set aside the particular nature of a productive activity, and thus the useful character of the labor involved, all that remains is an outlay of human labor power. Although tailoring and weaving are qualitatively different as productive activities, when people engage in the one just as when they engage in the other, they productively expend the power of their brains, muscles, nerves, hands, and so on. Tailoring and weaving, in this sense, are human labor. They are merely two different forms in which human labor power is expended. Human labor power certainly needs to develop to this or that point in order to be expended in this or that form, but a commodity's value represents only human labor as such, only an outlay of human labor in general. Just as military commanders and bankers play a big role in bourgeois society, whereas human beings in general have a puny one, so it is here with human labor, too. Human labor is the expenditure of simple labor power, the labor power that, on average, normal human beings possess in their physical organism without any special training. While what counts as this simple average labor varies according to country and cultural epoch, it is given in a particular society. More complex labor merely counts as enhanced, or better, multiplied simple labor, meaning that a smaller quantity of complex labor equals a greater quantity of simple labor. Experience shows that this reduction is constantly occurring. A commodity can be the product of the most complex labor, its value, however, makes it equal to the product of simple labor, and thus its value represents only a certain amount of simple labor. The diverse ratios in which diverse forms of labor are reduced to simple labor, as their unit of measurement, are established by a social process that takes place behind the backs of the producers, and so these ratios seem to them to be governed by tradition. In what follows, every type of labor power will be considered as simple labor power. This will merely spare us the trouble of reducing one type to another. With the values coat and linen, the difference between their use values is abstracted away, and the same thing happens with the labor represented in them. The difference between the useful forms of the two kinds of labor, tailoring and weaving, is abstracted away, too. As use values, the coat and the linen unite a purposeful, productive activity with raw cloth and raw yarn, respectively. But as values, they are bare gelatinous blobs of homogeneous labor. Thus the instances of labor contained in these values count for something not because of their productive relation to cloth and yarn, but rather only as outlays of human labor power. Tailoring and weaving can go into creating coats and linen as use values only because those two kinds of labor have different qualities. They can constitute the substance of coats and linen as values only insofar as their particular qualities are abstracted away, and they possess the same quality, the quality of being human labor. But the coat and the linen are not only values as such, they are values of a particular magnitude. According to our premise, one coat has twice as much value as 10 yards of linen. Where does the difference between their magnitudes of value come from? From the circumstance that the linen contains half as much labor as the coat. In order to produce the coat, labor power has to be expended for twice as long as it takes to produce the linen. If the labor contained in a commodity counts for something only qualitatively with respect to use value, that labor counts for something only quantitatively with respect to magnitude of value, once it has been reduced to human labor without further properties. In the first case, what matters is how the labor is performed and to what end. In the second, what matters is how much, for how long. Because a commodity's magnitude of value represents nothing but the amount of labor it contains, there must be certain ratios in which commodities are values of the same magnitude. If the productive power of tailoring remains constant, and so does that of all the other useful labor needed to make a coat, the value of the coats produced will increase along with their number. One coat will represent X work days, 2 coats will represent 2X work days, and so on. Now imagine if the labor that goes into producing a coat doubled or fell by half. In the first scenario, 1 coat would have as much value as 2 coats had formerly. In the second, 2 coats would have as much as 1 used to have, even though in both cases a given coat would perform the same function, and the useful labor contained in it would be of the same quality as before. But the quantity of labor expended to produce it would have changed. In and for itself, a greater quantity of use value amounts to greater material wealth. 2 coats amount to more than one. 2 coats can clothe 2 people, 1 coat just 1 person. Yet when the quantity of material wealth increases, this can correspond to a simultaneous drop in its value. This opposing movement arises from the double character of labor. Productive power is, of course, always the productive power of useful concrete labor, and it determines only how much a purposeful, productive activity can achieve in a given amount of time. Useful labor makes more or fewer products in direct proportion to how much its productive power increases or decreases. But variations in productive power have no effect at all on the labor represented in value on that labor in and for itself. Since productive power only has to do with the concrete useful form of labor, it naturally ceases to have any bearing on labor the moment labor's concrete useful form is abstracted away. The same labor of the same duration will always yield the same amount of value, regardless of whether its productive power varies. Within a given amount of time, however, labor will create different amounts of use values, more when its productive power increases, fewer when it decreases. The same change in productive power that increases the fruitfulness of labor, and therefore the number of use values created, will reduce the total magnitude of value belonging to the larger final quantity if it shortens the total amount of labor time needed to produce that quantity. And vice versa. On the one hand, all labor is human labor power expended physiologically. It is in this capacity as equal human labor or abstract human labor that labor creates commodity value. On the other hand, all labor is human labor power expended in a particular form that is determined by a goal. It is in this capacity or as concrete useful labor that labor produces use values. 3. The value form or exchange value. Commodities come into the world in the form of use values or physical commodity bodies, such as iron, linen, wheat, and so on. That is their homespun natural form. They are commodities only as a double entity, at once a use object and a bearer of value. Thus they appear as commodities, or have the form of commodities, only insofar as they have a double form, a natural form and a value form. The value objecthood of commodities differs from mistress quickly in that one knows not where to have it. Not even an atom of natural material goes into their value objecthood, in striking contrast to their objecthood as physical commodity bodies, which is a crude thing for the senses. However one might twist and turn an individual commodity, as a value thing, it remains ungraspable. But we need to remind ourselves that commodities possess value objecthood only insofar as they are expressions of the same social denominator, human labor, and that their value objecthood is thus purely social. This point should make the following one clear: the value objecthood of commodities can appear only in the social relation between commodity and commodity. In fact, we began with exchange value, or the exchange relation of commodities, in order to pick up the trail of their value hidden within it. We must now turn back to exchange value, that form of appearance of value. Everyone knows, even if they know nothing else, that commodities have a common value form that contrasts in the most dramatic way with the diverse natural forms of their use values, the money form. But here I want to do something bourgeois political economists have never even attempted: lay bare its genesis, or, in other words, trace the development of the value expression contained in the value relation of commodities, starting with the simplest and most inconspicuous form, and proceeding all the way to the dazzling money form. With that, the whole enigma of money will also be solved. The simplest value relation is obviously one commodity's value relation with a single commodity of a different kind, any different kind. The value relation of two commodities provides us, then, with the simplest expression of commodity value. A simple or individual value form. X commodity A equals Y commodity B, or X commodity A is worth Y commodity B. 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, or 20 yards of linen is worth 1 coat. 1. The two poles of a value expression, relative value form and equivalent form. The entire mystery of the value form lies hidden in this simple value form. To analyze this form is therefore our real challenge. Here two different commodities A and B, the linen and the coat, play two distinctly different roles, as we can see. The linen expresses its value through the coat serves as the material for expressing the linen's value. The first commodity plays an active role, the second plays a passive one. The value of the first commodity is represented as relative value, the commodity is in the relative value form. The second commodity acts as the equivalent, it is in the equivalent form. The relative value form and the equivalent form are a pair, inseparable and mutually determining. But at the same time, they are mutually exclusive, or positioned opposite each other, i.e., they make up the two poles of the same value expression. They continually distribute themselves to the different commodities that a value expression brings into relation with each other. For example, I cannot express the value of the linen through linen. 20 yards of linen equals 20 yards of linen isn't an expression of value. What the equation says, in fact, is the opposite. 20 yards of linen is nothing other than 20 yards of linen, a certain amount of the use value linen. The linen's value can thus be expressed only relatively, through a different commodity. The linen's relative value form presupposes some other commodity opposite it in the equivalent form. That other commodity, the one that acts as the equivalent, cannot also be in the relative value form. It doesn't express its own value. All it does is supply the material for another commodity's value expression. The expression 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, or 20 yards of linen is worth 1 coat, does imply the reverse equation, 1 coat equals 20 yards of linen, or 1 coat is worth 20 yards of linen. But in order to express the coat's value relatively, I have to turn the equation around in this way, and as soon as I do that, the linen takes the coat's place as the equivalent. Thus the same commodity can't occupy both forms simultaneously in the same value expression, rather, these opposing forms exclude each other. Whether a commodity is in the relative value form or the opposing equivalent form depends entirely on its position within each expression of value, in other words, on whether it is the commodity whose value is being expressed or the one through which value is expressed. 2. Relative value form. A. The content of the relative value form. If we want to find out how a commodity's simple value expression lies hidden in the value relation between two commodities, we have to begin by examining this relation quite apart from its quantitative side. People have tended to proceed the other way around, seeing in a value relation only the ratio in which certain amounts of two different types of commodities count as equal, and overlooking the fact that a quantitative comparison between the magnitudes of two different things isn't possible until they have been reduced to the same unit. Only as expressions of the same unit will they have a common denominator and thus be commensurable magnitudes. Whether 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat or equals 20 coats or equals x coats, that is, whether a given quantity of linen is worth few coats or many, every such relation implies, without exception, that as magnitudes of value, linen and coats are expressions of the same unit, things of the same nature. Linen equals coat is the basis of the equation. But the two commodities that are equated qualitatively do not play the same role. Only the value of the linen is expressed. How so? In that the linen relates to the coat as its, the linen's, equivalent or the thing it can be exchanged for. In this relation, the coat counts as value's form of existence, i.e., a value thing, because only as such is the coat the same as the linen. The linen's own value existence, on the other hand, comes into view, or attains an independent expression, because only as value can the linen relate to the coat as something of equal worth, or something that it, the linen, can be exchanged for. In the same way, butyric acid differs as a physical body from propyl formate, although they are made up of the same chemical substances carbon, C, hydrogen, H, and oxygen, O, in the same proportions, namely, CHO. If propyl formate were equated with butyric acid, first, the propyl formate would count in this relation merely as a form of existence of CHO, second, this would say that the butyric acid is also made up of CHO. Equating the propyl formate with the butyric acid would express the butyric acid's chemical substance rather than its physical form. When we say, as values, commodities are bare gelatinous blobs of human labor, our analysis reduces commodities to a value abstraction but doesn't give them a value form different from their natural forms. Not so in the value relation of one commodity with another. What brings out a commodity's value character here is its relation with a second commodity.
Okay, I will stop there
Hello? Pronto? Can you hear me?
Yes. Thanks.
Am I echoing or can you hear me directly?
No, it sounds good.
All right, fine. Well, that was my little experiment. I had my other computer set up to play it as on the second account, and then I opened up a multiple share and then put it in the primary share. I know it's kind of hard to listen to. Would it have been better faster or slower? And what I'm thinking of doing is running these things, doing it at, sort of a chapter or a section at a time, outside of regularly scheduled time. And then people could just, sort of both read it and listen to it at the same time. Does that make any sense for people? It's sort of getting around the idea that everyone has to buy their own damn copy. Questions? Comments? No one cares. All right. Anna says she will speak in a moment.
Yeah, I hoped you would stop YouTube first.
Well, I don't know. How should we proceed? Should I continue on this little project? In other words, if I just run the software so it just, reads it, and then you can adjust speed and whatever on your own time. Or do people prefer the female voice than the generic male voice? There are three versions. Talk about sexism. There are three different versions of the male voice, and there's only one for the female voice.
It's quite interesting, just a bit hard to follow when it's this generated voice.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's so mechanical, and kind of it kind of forces you to read forward, but only in this form. I mean, if you see this on a YouTube, on the YouTube channel, you can just stop where you need to and you read the whole page. Some of us read pages rather than words or sentences at a time. In other words, I'd turn off if I were looking at it and I saw it on the YouTube channel, I would shut the audio off and just read it.
Yeah, but I found the tempo good. It's 1.25.
I'm sorry?
I found the tempo really good.
Oh, okay.
It is 1.25.
That's why I cranked it up a little bit to 1.25, because I think it reads a little better, slightly faster, but that's just, it sounds even more mechanical if you're running it at normal speed, at 1x speed.
Yes, and then you just get tired faster.
Yeah. I mean, I'm happy to continue on this little project because, it's only 944 pages.
And we were at page.
And really what I'm doing is essentially, I'm essentially operating the internet as a photocopier, whatever. So people don't have to buy their own $27 or $30 copy of the damn book. I'm sure someone is going to subvert because that's what happens. There are free copies of other, for example, all the other copies of Marx. They're out somewhere in PDF or EPUB form. this one has not yet been subverted. Although I suppose there's an anarchist out there who is subverting this. And I do appreciate Nancy's account that a mechanical voice is talking about labor.
Yeah, exactly.
But I do, with better AI or cheaper AI, that's actually really, it's not so much better as existing AI is better. It's more expensive. That's all. It takes up more memory to prepare a more naturally appearing sentence. I mean, that is a oral sentence as opposed to a read sentence. No one else? No comments? I mean, I would certainly probably have to put in less labor, less yammer time by having the machine do it. But if it's just unpleasant for people, one shouldn't have to do that. And really, the only difference is that this is just a brand new translation in English. There are X number of other versions out there. Well, no one cares. Well, let me think about this. Certainly, we can try this again once or twice this coming week in Dis and Dat, and I will think of other ways to do this. I'm happy to read it. I mean, I'm happy to read for an hour. I don't mind doing that. I just think this would be a way of perhaps doing it more efficiently. Allow people to get a copy of fundamentally a copy of this original. And Nancy.
Yes, I was just thinking, I think people should buy the book if they want to have the contents of the book and support the author and
Yes.
and absorb the material. I mean, I think it's if you really want to understand it, it's better to literally read the text yourself.
Yeah, I would say so.
But anyway, it's not, doesn't matter to me. I mean, people can buy the book or not. But
I mean, it is a pretty pricey object, with all due respect.
oh, how much is the book?
The hard copy's moderately expensive. The ebook is $31, I think.
Oh, so if you bought like a paper book, is it more?
Slightly more.
Is it like $80?
Oh no, more like $40 or $50.
Oh, hey.
But it's still a lot of money, right?
I don't know about that.
Well, it suggests something about the way in which we learn and how much markets are worth or whatever. And if you're have certain political leanings, you get the sense of how much profit is being made, ironically, from publishing Marx.
Well, I don't want any more books in my life, so it's the question, it's a moot point for me. But if I really wanted to understand what the person was writing, if I thought it was crucial to my development as a human being, I would pay $40 and get the book.
Yeah. Although Anna's point is important, do I want to buy this week or do I want to buy food this week? So anyway, Max Nick, I think I may just continue this project just because I think it's part of my modest contribution to subversion. But otherwise, I won't force people to have to listen to this mechanical version of the text. Should do their own reading. But as I say, providing this material, it's just different. There are just other copies of Capital Volume 1 available. They're just older English translations.
Oh, I didn't even know that's what it is. But anyway.
This is Karl Marx, Capital, Volume 1, a new translation by Paul North and Paul Retter. It's the first one in 30 years or whatever. So that's what's, remarkable about it in that sense. It has more colloquial constructions of English, because that's what bogs me down in reading Capital, is that I'm going, oh, this is 19th century construction of a sentence, and it's hard to figure out what's going on. It's sort of, it's probably essential to do this every 30 years, to redo these.
You seem to like this translation in particular.
I haven't quite decided yet, but it does read okay, and actually I don't get bogged down in it as I do when I read the Penguin edition. On the other hand, the physical book, I don't own a copy of the physical book. I own a copy of the ebook, and electronic versions of books are better for me because my eyes are beginning to fail, and occasionally I need a magnifier. So the advantage for me of digital books is that I can expand the type to something that's more comfortable. That's all. And books that I have floating around require me to get out a magnifying glass to sort of, it's not that hard. I mean, my eyes aren't that bad, but it is frustrating. Let's put it that way.
I kind of thought that looking at screens makes my vision worse.
Well, that too. I mean, it's blue, whatever, blue light or whatever. I mean, ultimately, it's not good for you. You have to make all the usual accessibility adjustments. Proper contrast, etc. On the other hand, in order to work more efficiently, I'd probably have to crank up contrast, which isn't excessive.
I did not mean to suggest that you shouldn't have this available to people, because I'm sure some people will maybe listen in the car or whatever people do.
Yes, that's the other reason to do it too, because I know that people do function asynchronously here.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks for everyone's input. I will cogitate over this now that I've figured out how to play one thing on one computer and show it on another. I'm only more depressed because in the 1980s, this little activity is really hard to set up. Those whippersnappers are used to too much easy digital access. Okay, I will return you to not wanting to violate copyright, etc. I will decide further on whether to continue doing this activity, although I think it's a